Okay, hey guys, we're going to look at Egypt, okay? So, this is covering lesson 1, the Nile River Valley. So, I want you to listen up as we discuss the Egyptian civilization. We're only covering the first lesson in today's video. So, let me get my screen right. So, I know we didn't label some of these cities here, and so just keep in mind the map that we've been looking at. We've been talking about Giza and Memphis and Thebes, and obviously looking at the Nile River itself. So let's see, the gift of the Nile. The Nile brought life to Egypt. So here we're looking at this fan shape root looking, if you look on a map, it almost looks like a root of a plant. And this is actually the delta of the Nile, and it actually runs into the Mediterranean Sea. All right, let's look at the next slide. So the river is 4,000 miles long. It flows north. There are strong cataracts or rapids at different points in the river, so that makes traveling kind of difficult because of the rapids. If you think about, that you've seen on TV, if you ever went whitewater rafting before, picture something like that. The Nile actually flows in this way into the Mediterranean Sea because this is a higher elevation. All right, so it says in Lower Egypt, the Nile divides into several branches. The branches form a delta, and a triangle-shaped area of land is made of soil deposited by the river. And so here you can see this is the delta it creates, and let's see. So the Nile floods, and in our textbook, if you read, the thing is, the difference between Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates, and the Nile is that the Tigris and Euphrates had unpredictable floods. So that was a challenge for the people of Mesopotamia. They didn't know when the floods would happen. However, the Nile, the Egyptians knew that it had predictable flooding, that it flooded certain times of the year, and they could prepare for that. And when the floods came and left, it would bring deposits of silt, which made the soil very fertile for farming. So here you see the Nile, and it's up here. All right, so why was Egypt called the gift of the Nile? Without the gift of flooding that provided rich soil for crops, civilizations could not have developed in Egypt. So flooding was a gift to Egypt because it did deposit those nutrients into the soil for them to be able to farm. Civilizations on the Nile, hunter-gatherers, we talked about that a few chapters ago. They literally go out and look for their food. They're always on the move. It says hunter-gatherers groups moved to the Nile around 12,000 years ago because there were lots of plants and animals. The Nile was a very fertile area. Egypt was a very fertile area. Let's see. Civilizations on the Nile. Egypt has natural barriers that protect the people living there. So here we are in Egypt in the Nile River, okay, and we have the Sinai Peninsula here, and over on the west side we have the Sahara Desert. So let's look at this. It says Egypt has its own natural barriers that protect the people living there. It has deserts to the west, the Sahara Desert, the Mediterranean Sea to the north, and the Red Sea to the east, and cataracts along the Nile River to make traveling difficult. So it had all these natural protectors around it, the deserts and water around it, and cataracts. So here's just a nice map of the Nile and Egypt so that you can see the delta. It's very fertile here. It looks like a fan shape. We know that two rivers come together, the White Nile and the Blue Nile, and they form into the Nile River, and these are called tributaries. Let's see, we're going to skip over that. These are just some random facts. In 3100 BC, a leader named Menes rose to power. He joined Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom. We're going to get more into that in lesson 2. As in lesson 1, I'm going to flip through here for a second. Let's see, I'm going to come back a few slides right here. So, like I said, the Egyptians knew that the Nile had predictable flooding. The Egyptians had created, it says, in time the Egyptian farmers created new tools. We know new tools are technology. They created a shaduf, and that is a vocabulary term. It's a bucket attached with a long pole that lifts water from the Nile, and it empties it into a basin. We know that they discovered papyrus, which is a plant that is grown along the Nile on the banks, and they use that to make paper. They had a form of writing. The Mesopotamians used cuneiform to write, and the Egyptians developed their own symbols. And it was like pictures. Like if they wanted to draw a house, they would draw a house, and eventually, they their pictures turned into sounds of symbols, and they created hieroglyphics. And just like in Mesopotamia, certain people could study how to write. Not many people knew how to write, but men could study how to write and go to school for that. And they could become scribes, and they could work in the government. Trade routes ran through Egypt. The Nile was a way of transportation. So people could travel, like city-states in Mesopotamia kind of served their own, they functioned as a city-state, and they didn't really depend on other city-states. But in Egypt, these cities could trade with one another because they were right along the Nile, and they could travel and visit other city-states, and trade was really big. We looked at uniting Egypt on page 106 in our text, and it says forming kingdoms. The need for organized government became increasingly important as farmers and trade increased. We know that they could create a surplus of food because they were able to control some of the river by irrigation, like the Mesopotamians did. A government was necessary to oversee the construction and repair of irrigation ditches and dams on the Nile. A government was needed to develop a process of storing and distributing grain during famines, and a famine is a time where there's not much food, so they would store food as a city-state in order to distribute it at a later time. And there's a story in the Bible that includes about Joseph, if you're familiar with that, and how he was in charge of storing food in Egypt, and he worked for the Pharaoh. It's a really good story, and I encourage you, if you haven't read it in a long time, to go back and read it. You're going to see some really familiar terms when you go back and look at it. So it says, over time, groups of villages merged from small kingdoms. Each of these kingdoms was ruled by a king. The weaker kingdoms eventually fell under control of stronger ones. So eventually, around 4000 BC, Egypt was made up of two large kingdoms. One was Upper Egypt, and it was located to the south-central part of the Nile River Valley, and the other was Lower Egypt, and it was located along the Nile River's north delta. So this is actually up here, Lower Egypt, and this is Upper Egypt. So it's kind of, reverse thinking here. Narmer was a king under Upper Egypt, which would be here, about 3100 BC, and he led his armies from the valley north into the Delta Valley, conquering Lower Egypt, and married one of the Lower Egyptian princesses, and he unified the kingdoms. For the first time, all of Egypt was united under one king. Lower and Upper Egypt then was united under Narmer, the king, and that's when dynasties were introduced. So the right to rule was passed from father to son, then to grandson. So it stayed within the family, and that's called a dynasty. When one dynasty died out, another took its place. So there was from 3100 BC to 332 BC, there were a series of 30 different dynasties. 30 different families that ruled Egypt. These dynasties are organized into 3 different time periods, and that's Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. And we're going to talk about that throughout this chapter. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed listening to this short lecture. It wasn't very long. Check your homework, or your classwork is what then you were supposed to